RAM. What is RAM? In this video, I'm going to be talking about RAM. What is RAM? RAM, which stands for Random Access Memory, is the data stored in RAM, which can be accessed almost instantly regardless of where memory in it's stored. So it's very fast, milliseconds fast. RAM has a very fast path to the computer's CPU, or central processing unit, the brain of the computer that does the most of the work. Well, basically, RAM is it's basically short-term storage. It's kind of like your pantry. So yes, we have two types of RAM. Though this one on the top is the one which you could find in most computers and most laptops. And the bottom one here is where you could find gaming PCs, pre-built gaming PCs, and stuff like that. Okay, now there's the second part. So yes, now you might be thinking, what does a grocery store, a pantry, and a countertop have to do with all this? Well, here it is. So the grocery store is basically like your SSD, or solid state drive, or even hard drive. It's basically a smaller grocery store. Most people have SSD nowadays. So yes, unless you're using a school computer. So an SSD is basically the grocery store, and your pantry is basically your RAM, and your countertop can be represented as your CPU. So yes, so at your grocery store, if you go to a grocery store, you buy things and it's stored into your pantry, and your countertop is basically, let's say you want to make some pizza, so you go buy all the ingredients from the pizza in the grocery store, and let's say you want to make as much pizzas as you can, but as long as they fit as much as you can, but as long as they fit in the pantry. So your CPU is basically how fast you can make the pizzas. Well, basically at the same quality level, but how fast you can make the pizzas and what's the quality of the pizzas. So yes, that's your countertop, or that's basically your CPU. The pantry is basically your RAM. It's basically how much data can be stored in it, or in this case, how many pizzas or how many of the ingredients of pizzas can be stored in the pantry. And in the grocery store as well, the SSD. The bigger the SSD, basically the bigger the grocery store. Like if there's let's say you go to Walmart, there's like Supercenter Walmarts, right? There's a Walmart Supercenter and the normal Walmarts. So yes, that's basically how the higher the capacity of the storage of the SSD. The RAM, there's also how fast the RAM is. So yes, the bigger the pantry, the more gigabytes there is. Let's say you want a more normal computer nowadays has 16 gigs of RAM. Or if you're using something like, I don't know, a school computer or a school Chromebook, they have 2 to 4 gigs. And this is also a main factor. For example, if you don't have enough RAM and you have like a really good CPU, it's basically a waste of time, because since you don't have enough RAM, your CPU will just be left there like wasting time, not doing anything. It would be basically wasted CPU space. For example, let's just say that you don't have enough RAM in your computer. What this does is the RAM gives it back to the grocery store. Okay, let's take an example. So yes, what happens if you don't have enough RAM in your computer? Well, let's say sometimes you need to take a break. So basically, your CPU needs to take a break. And sometimes some of that pizzas can't be stored since it's keep on getting data from the grocery store. It's kind of like a machine, let's just say a factory. There's data which keeps coming from the grocery store or pizza things, and the CPU is getting tired. Let's say you have a weak CPU and not enough RAM. Another way, the RAM would give it back to the grocery store, since there's data which is keep coming, but the RAM doesn't have enough space to store it, so it gives it back, which is a delay in RAM. So yes, this is one delay. So yes, this is basically it. If you have a really weak, if you don't have enough RAM, let me just tell you another part. So So yes, let's continue. So yes, RAM. Well, let's say if you didn't have enough RAM, well, your RAM would be giving it back to the grocery store, since it doesn't have enough space to store all the data that's keep coming from the grocery store. On the other hand, if you have a really fast CPU, this wouldn't be a problem, because since the CPU is able to execute it so fast that the RAM doesn't need to give it back to the grocery store, and the grocery store could keep giving it to the RAM or the pantry. Okay, let's take it into a pizza maker perspective. So the grocery store are all the pizza ingredients. The pantry is, well, how many pizza can be stored, and these are the chefs. So let's take two chefs. Two chefs can make, let's just say one chef can make one pizza per minute. Let's just say, which is probably impossible, but let's just say that's how it works. So yes, so it means he can make one pizza per minute, and two chefs can make two pizzas per minute. So yes, and your pantry can only store, well, let's just say your pantry can store 3 pizzas, for example. Let's just say, since the grocery store is giving it to your pantry at 3 pizzas per minute, and, well, let's just say your grocery store is giving the pantry 3 pizzas per minute, and your CPU can only make 2 pizzas per minute. Every minute, your pantry is giving back 1 pizza back to the grocery store, therefore wasting time just doing that extra step. On the other hand, if you have 3 pizza workers, or let's just say 3-core CPU, which doesn't exist. Let's just say there's 3 pizza persons. This would be perfect. The grocery store gives 3 pizzas, the RAM can store 3 pizzas, and the workers can do 3 pizzas per minute. It would be a perfect cycle. Let's say it's a RAM bottleneck. Let's say you have RAM which is only 2 GB, or let's say it can only store 2 pizzas. Your grocery store is giving it at a rate of 3 pizzas, and your CPU can do at like has 3 workers. So your grocery store is giving it at 3 pizzas per second, and let's just say per minute. Your pantry can only store 2 pizzas. So it's again, even though you have a good CPU, the RAM, it doesn't have enough. Therefore, there isn't enough RAM. The RAM has to give 1 pizza back to the grocery store, which is wasting time again. So yes, there are 2 types of ways you can bottleneck your computer. Either about bottleneck by the CPU or the RAM. If you don't have enough RAM, it can bottleneck your computer, or if you don't have a good enough CPU, it can also bottleneck your computer. Well, not exactly. For example, if you have lots of RAM and you have a okay CPU, you will be able to store some of those pizzas in the RAM. But if you have a bad CPU, if you have a good CPU and very little RAM, well, it will still be a bottleneck, but not as much, since the CPU is executing it way faster than the RAM can even store the data. So yes, there's 2 bottlenecks. And yes, that's it. Now there's another factor. It's, well, RAM speeds. Well, most people only know, well, how much the gigabytes of RAM. For example, there's 4 GB, 8 GB, 16 GB, 32, and, well, very likely, and probably in some overkill gaming computers, 64 gigs, or even creator computers or laptops, which is like real expensive. So yes, another major plague factor is the RAM speed. If you see something like this, 4,000 megahertz, and then this one on the right, we have 2,000 megahertz, or 2,066 megahertz RAM. Well, what is the difference? Well, RAM is basically how fast it is. The gigabytes, or 16 gigabytes, is the storage of how much it can hold, or basically how much ones and zeros, or how much data it can store. That's the gigabytes in the short term. And then there's the speed, which is basically how fast it can take it from the SSD and feed it into the CPU. Well, this is basically RAM speed. And well, what you might be thinking is, hey, which is faster, 4000 megahertz or 2066 megahertz? Well, if you're thinking 4000 megahertz, you're wrong. On the and right at the same time. On the right is correct, for now, at least. Well, what does this mean? This means that your CPU is basically, it's kind of like a baby. The faster the CPU, the bigger its mouth. For example, let's take you say like a 400-pound man versus a baby. A 400-pound man could eat more things quicker than a baby. For example, he could probably eat 2 slices of pizza in under a minute compared to a baby who can't even eat one in like 30 minutes. So yes, this is the difference. This is a big man with a big fat man who could eat more, and he could eat it faster compared than a baby, which is a small CPU with lower cores and a faster, lower frequency, which can't eat as much. So yes, it's kind of like, let's say you give 2 pizzas a second. Let's say you feed 2 pizzas a minute to a big 400-pound person who can eat exactly 2 pizzas a minute. What would happen? Well, the 2 pizzas would go directly into his mouth, and right when he finished, the next slices of pizza would come. But let's say you give it to a baby. Well, it would choke, obviously, and let's not talk about what happens next. But yes, what would happen is that baby won't be able to eat it, which is basically what would happen is the CPU would give it back. Or let's just say a baby cannot give it back. It will probably just spit it out. That's the same with the CPU. If it gets fed too much information, or just spit it out, it would spit out the extras, causing it a delay, which would make it slower. So yes, even our fastest CPUs today can only do 3,200 megahertz, like the 5950X will do 3,200 megahertz, or basically 3.2 pizzas per second, or let's just say for example, 3.2 pizzas. Well, let's say you have a Celeron. You can't feed 3.2 pizzas a second. You have to feed way lower, because it's basically a baby. Because he cannot take that much information. And even if you give it that much information, it wouldn't exactly choke. It would probably just spit it out like a baby. If you give it too much food, it would spit it out. That's the same with a CPU, which cannot take that much information. It would just spit it out. So for now, the 2066 megahertz RAM would be faster. But in the future, when we have faster CPUs with more cores, better architecture, lower nanometers, which are just basically faster in general, the 4000 megahertz RAM would be better, and would even be better and faster. So yes, but for now, we're sticking with 3000 megahertz RAM, because that's the max it can handle. And if you give 4000 megahertz RAM or 4 pizza per second, it wouldn't be able to handle it, and it would just result in choking and spitting.